Hello, everyone. Enjoy these relaxing yet powerful stories of resilience and triumph. Judge Grayson thought he was sentencing a clueless teen until the defendant started dismantling the case like a seasoned lawyer. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. The defendant's table looked too big for the young man standing beside it. Hands in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Jaylen Dawson, 19, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him made it clear. The real trial had nothing to do with the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood of his desk. He peered down at Jaylen over the rim of his glasses, his lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried a dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor, they were all in on the joke. Jaylen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment, not this exact one. He never planned on standing here as a defendant, but he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and Jaylen had grown up listening to the stories she brought home. How prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students, but none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jaylen was just another kid in trouble. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again, but this time something shifted. Jaylen's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, because Grayson had just made his first mistake. But the courtroom hadn't noticed yet. If stories like this speak to you, stories of truth, power, and resilience, hit that like button and subscribe to RVM Black Struggles. Let's make sure these voices are never silenced. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jaylen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with weight. The crowd in the gallery shifted, whispering among themselves. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car, a chase, running. Judge Grayson glanced at Jaylen over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on." The prosecutor walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jaylen for the first time. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jaylen didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book. If you're feeling what Jaylen's going through, let us know. Comment 1 if this story resonates with you, comment 0 if it doesn't. But if you're somewhere in the middle, just hit that subscribe button to follow more real stories on RVM Black Struggles." Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me, and for most people in the room it probably did. The case was clear-cut. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest, but Jaylen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the crack. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Jaylen's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. "Your Honor, my client." Jaylen placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down, and for the first time Jaylen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went completely silent. Grayson stared at him, clearly amused. "You'll what?" Jaylen's voice was calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jaylen took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the courtroom settled around Jaylen as he adjusted his stance, his hands still in his pocket. He let the silence stretch just a little longer, enough to make them uncomfortable. Then finally he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." Jaylen took a slow step forward. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply, already bored. "That's right. And that testimony is written in his report." "Of course it is." Jaylen nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Grayson squinted at him. "On what grounds?" Jaylen pulled his hands from his pockets, for the first time, and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Jaylen took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history." But he let the word hang in the air. "I have a feeling it won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Grayson frowned, glancing toward Carrington. Counselor Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law." "Your Honor, are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Jaylen gave a small, almost casual shrug. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS did. We'll prove it. But if he wasn't," he let the sentence trail off. Grayson studied him for a long moment, then turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS log?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. Jaylen took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, their tactics, the way they played the system. And there was one thing he knew without a doubt. If Carrington was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor." Carrington finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was loud. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence cracking around the edges. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jaylen gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "That's true." He took a step forward. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Jaylen turned to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically." He took a deep breath, his tone staying calm, controlled. "Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Jaylen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. "I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it, didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity." He let that sit for a second. Then in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything to regain control. Jaylen wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done." He turned to Grace. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly, "No." Jaylen's lips pressed together. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis." Carrington's jaw tightened. Jaylen nodded, like that was all he needed to hear. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Jaylen wasn't done yet, because the next thing he was about to say would change everything. Jaylen took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Judge Grayson frowned. The owner? Jaylen nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. He turned to Carrington. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Jaylen didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jaylen held the paper up. That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it, and yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle, but Jaylen shook his head. No, I wasn't. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumption. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Jaylen turned back to the jury. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area, and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. Silence. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington was stiff, his face flushed. No, Your Honor. Judge Grayson exhaled. He looked at Jaylen for a long time, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence, then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks. Jaylen didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, looked at Jaylen with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe even regret. Jaylen met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jaylen stopped but didn't turn. Grayson hesitated, then finally said, you should consider law school. Jaylen smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Jaylen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? Jaylen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the questions. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. His mother, Denise, was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment she just looked at him. Then finally she shook her head and let out a breath. Boy, you scared me half to death. Jaylen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, ma. She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras kept flashing, but Jaylen wasn't paying attention to them anymore. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew he'd remember this one, because Jaylen had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself, and for once, it blinked first. Here's the lesson we should learn. How many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted, not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth. Jaylen had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. He knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change, but only if we make them. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep the conversation going, because next time, it might not be Jaylen, it might be someone you know. Life has a way of putting you in situations where the odds feel stacked against you, where people judge you before hearing your side, and the system, whether in work, school, or society, seems to have already made up its mind. That's what makes Jaylen's story so powerful and relevant today. It's not just a courtroom drama. It's a reminder that knowledge, preparation, and the courage to speak up can be the difference between being silenced and being heard. Like Jaylen, we all face moments where we are underestimated, where people assume the worst because of how we look, where we come from, or what we've been through. But the key lesson here is that when you know your truth, and you've done the work mentally, emotionally, or educationally, you can walk into any room and hold your ground. Jaylen didn't win because he was loud or aggressive. He won because he was informed, calm, and ready. That's advice worth living by. In your current life, this means not letting the labels others place on you define your direction. Whether you're trying to build a career, change your circumstances, or overcome past mistakes, know this: preparation matters. Read, study, ask questions, and understand the systems around you. Too often we assume things can't be changed, that people in power can't be challenged, or that injustice is something we just have to accept. Jaylen's story tells us the opposite. The moment we become aware, the moment we choose to stand and speak with clarity and courage, we begin to shift the narrative. Even if you're not facing a courtroom battle, you might be facing bias at work, misunderstanding in your relationships, or discouragement in your dreams. Instead of shrinking, dig deeper, sharpen your skills, learn how to articulate your truth, because someday, you may need to speak, not just for yourself, but for others who haven't yet found their voice. And don't forget the role of community. Jaylen's mother was his silent strength, a reminder that we all need someone in our corner. Seek out those who challenge you, support you, and keep you grounded. And when you've grown, when you've overcome, be that person for someone else. The system, whatever it may be in your context, won't change unless we do the hard, intentional work of showing up, informed and unafraid. So here's your challenge. Prepare like Jaylen, speak like Jaylen, lead like Jaylen, because the world needs more people who don't just react to injustice, but who are ready to confront it with truth, discipline, and the unshakable belief that one voice can make the system blink.